Chapter 1. Sweet Preparations. The denizens of the little lodges and caravans at the roadside station slept away, undisturbed, no need to waken for a few hours yet. Only one soul stirred among them, tucked into the nook upstairs in a big treehouse. Inside, there lay a snoring ball of fur, lost in a wild dreamscape. Now, normally I'm sure you'd agree with me, there's nothing new in our dreams, right? It's just little snippets and vignettes from real life, memories and thoughts, only projected through the grand cinema of the mind. On those silver screens, even the most bizarre occurrences should theoretically correspond to the waking world, do you agree? You might, for instance, look over a bridge, only to see a furry wild pig turn into a tree log, then fly away into the sky in a stream of pink clouds. Preposterous, right? But you've at least seen a bridge, a pig, and a log, maybe even a stream of pink clouds before. Maybe you were sitting at a barbecue that day, as a suckling pig roasted on a spit, who knows, but we know it came from somewhere. That was not the case for the dreamer in the nook this morning. As with each creep of the morning light across Valewood, the furball vividly dreamt a most unfamiliar nightmare. Through a misty veil, some obscured horror stalking just out of reach, and all the elements astir, the wind howling malevolently, tongues weaving unnatural hexes, the earth shaking below a stranger's feet. The hands grasping forward were not her own, clutching at veiled figures she can't see clearly, out over a precipice and mouthing wordlessly, with 1,000 mouths, red eyes in the sky. Down and then. And now falling. Oh no, oh no. Arg! Bones, she screamed. Huh? Landing with a thud on the floor, the furball unfurled into the shape of a little cat girl. As the room did that thing, confustigated, after you wake up in the morning, swirling back into something recognizable, all was well again, the world hadn't ended overnight. Yawning and stretching, rubbing soot and gritty sleep from her strange eyes, one the deepest sapphire blue, the other a minty emerald green, the little cat girl grabbed her morning robe and tiptoed to the nearest window, eager to check the weather. Wiping the foggy glass clean and squinting through the glare of the sun, she confirmed it, a glorious day ahead. She bounced softly back into bed, once a horrific dreamscape but now just a mess of leaf and flannel. A dewy damp penetrated the room on a draft overnight, the type that hangs on the chests of the heavier men around the camp. She imagined they'll be coughing and hacking all morning, but they'd be asleep for hours yet. Clef was always up early, but awoke especially so this morning to undertake a great and noble endeavor, unobstructed. With a sleepy snort, and a last, long stretch, she pulled herself up from her bed, in the small hollow of the trunk, upstairs in the treehouse at Penpore Station. You might not think the alcove much, but Clef had the run of the place. She could have any room in Penpore Station if she wanted, her dad running the joint and all, but something about the little alcove in the tree trunk was just right. She wouldn't ever say so herself, but since she never knew her mum, she liked to imagine the way the hollow hugs her in, was just what a hug from her mum would be like. She sighed softly, smacked her lips and gently pawed at her whiskers through a yawn. I mentioned she was a cat, or really what they call a felanxy. They come from a real place, far off from where you're reading this book, and I don't think you'll ever be able to go there yourself unfortunately. But they do exist, and it does exist, so the events here recorded could actually be considered a true story. Yes, in a far off and altogether different world from yours, there were people who were cats. Much like your cats and kittens of Earth, they were lions, tigers, lynxes, pumas, leopards, cheetahs, except they were cats who walked on their hind legs and spoke a language called the shed, smoked pipes, farmed beetles, sailed ships, and ate sweets, a bit like your human. But they are also unique, even in their own world. Some people think they come from outer space. Maybe they do, I don't know, I'm more of a dog person myself, really. 3 firm knocks on the floor below confirmed breakfast was on, so she jumped into her master plan for the morning, where she scrambled all sorts of bags, jars, nets, boxes, and papers together. She wasn't sure what came first, the knocks promising breakfast or the smell of bacon rising. So many rude and delicious obstructions to her grand design. She had great cause to be excited as well, but we can discuss that after food. From the mezzanine above the mess of the Penpore Station boarding house, she clambered over the banister and sailed down gracefully to the lower floor, running her claws along thick ropes that dangled from the ceiling. Usually if her dad saw her cutting like that, she'd get a telling off, but what he doesn't see can't hurt him, she reasoned. She had good reason to want to get down below quickly. The mess was already far busier than usual. Caravaneers were preparing wagons and carriages for a journey today, plus the dawn watch would be coming in from Cendric's Tower shortly for their grub. Of course, none of them knew of her grave undertaking this morning, let alone understand it all. Even I struggle with it, and I know everything. Today was King's Day, and there was to be a very special festival in the nearby town of Terwilligenbridge. According to Clef's sibling our team, it's the day when our calendar and the Stornishmans are on the same day. It only happens every so often, and they have a big festival from noon of the day before, until noon the next day, when the 2 clocks strike 2 noons at the same time. Our team is a bookish sort, so most of that probably went over Clef's head the first time around. She and her friends knew what they needed to know. There would be games, sweets, prizes, fireworks, food, parades, a bonfire, camping overnight, and, most important, the Sharpshooters Biennale. She quivered just hearing those words. As an aspiring sharpshot herself, this was one of the few really big occasions in the woods to show off at ranged sports, outside of the regular competitive circuit she already ranks in. Of course, she would only compete in the Pudding Cup, but she was taking it home by any means necessary, as far as she was concerned. She ducked into the basins to wash up, knowing the routine. If you don't wash, wash no soap. Soap. Dried after, teeth, tail, comb, clip, and 2 eye drops. If you don't clean the basin. Dry the floor? You get the idea. She was busy thinking about seeing Art again, and Panzu, her eldest brother, would be coming up to visit with the druids. Art, or should I say, Barth. Professor Artim has been studying with some wizards far away in the Porcolio Mountains to the north. Panzu on the other hand was called to the druids in Idawood, and now lived at the Star Tree Temple. They are always studying the stars and nature down there. I don't understand much of what they talk about, but Dad seems to revel in it. When he and Panzu get together, they have these long talks, which keep them very close. As for Artemi, even Dad doesn't get what Art talks about. It's all astrolabes and universal physioelasticity, quadratic formulae, ZZZ. She made her way fresh and clean to the mess, up to the breakfast bar, eager for bacon. First came the test. She heard the heavy trundling footsteps behind the bar, still too short to see over it, and the shadow of a tall figure spreading along the wall behind. The stout figure of Clef's father, the great one-eyed lion Maximo Cendrico, scanned her up and down through the usual scowl. She always tries to stand to attention like a soldier being inspected, but being only as tall as her father's leg, she always ends up giggling and breaking form, which loses her marks for composure, as he explained one time before. He blusters, puffs, and huffs as he methodically scans from hands to face to feet to tail tip, taking deep sniffs of air slowly as he does, assessing scent and breath. But he'll smell only fresh soap and crushed aloe berry this day, she cackled to herself triumphantly. Report compiled and his one eye closed, and then open, Maximo raised a single finger and spoke. No cutting. Her face nearly hit the floor, furiously stepping forward, an accusatory finger raised. There's no way you could have seen that, old man. The same quiet voice, no cutting. She stomped melodramatically back and forth, seething, before quickly shaking to her senses from ears to tail tip, transforming into a beaming smile. Sorry Dad, right you are. No cutting. His one eye widened. Oh, so you did cut? He cackled, handing her a heaped plate of egg, bacon, a bread roll, tomatoes, olives, and some mackerel. She gratefully retreated, bested again. Grumbling, she went to the long table, consoled herself that she at least beat the breakfast rush, and gorged. The memory of the dream this morning was quickly fading away, but the appetite it gave her demanded satisfaction. A trickle of men and women came down to the mess for breakfast as she chomped her way through oddly shaped pancakes and guzzled milk. Some armed guardsmen in the Sendrix Tower colors came through the front door, dawnwatch patrollers who guard the camp for the second half of the night. A good night, she munched pensively, the same number back today as left in the night. A few scratches and muck here and there, made for a sore but pleasant sight, given the circumstances. By her count, they'd lost 17 guards to various attacks in the last few months alone. Dad tried to hide it from the young ones around the camp, but no effort could muffle the whispers and rumors, or obfuscate the many missing faces from the small community. After work, many of the staff, lodge folk, residents, and passers-by, discussed in the bonfire light at night over their drinks how the Werball were increasingly agitated, how Nox attacks were becoming more frequent and more violent. Next up came a few more of the regular guests who more or less lived permanently at the treehouse with Clef and Dad, whom she'd long ago given alliterative nicknames: Ralph the Red-Faced, Genial Genevieve, Silky Susan, Angry Alfred, all of whom greeted her like a daughter every morning. After them came the dogs, like a howling wall of fluffy faces and waggling tails a few feet from the ground. All shapes of Upinder dogfolk rushed to their bowls for breakfast. She knew Alpa and Lambda would be along in the throng, but figured it's best not to disturb them at the breakfast troughs. All these groups came down the far staircases and barn door from the commons, while caravaneers and lodgemen passed by the station doors and side entrances, grabbing food and tea to start the day. There was a lot of cargo to be loaded on wagons that accompanied the passenger carriages on the journey today, all of which were greater than usual given the rare occasion ahead. Right on cue, the thick ceiling ropes began to crackle and rattle as the elevators to the lofts came down from the penthouses above Clef's room. Up there were nicer rooms operated by Mrs. Thorgood, or as she described them, the more nicer suites for the paying merchants and such, which always made Clef wonder what sort of suites they were. Surely they couldn't be nicer than Pom Chocolate. Interspersed through the traffic were the relatives of the caravaneers and staff of the station, who lived in the lodges but came in for breakfast anyway. The mess soon became a tumult of plates clanging, coffee gulping, and even light music played amid the hushed morning conversations. All were delighted to see the sunny day, as it meant the Terwilligen Bridge Festival would be all the more special. Of all the guests and guardsmen present, Clef fixed on the newcomer, a Sugari nomad from the desert far west of Penpore Station and Valewood itself. Arteme says it is large enough to fit the whole of Valewood 6 times, well, 5, if the High King has his way in the hinterlands. Brainbox. Anyway, the stranger was no doubt a festival goer. He managed to stick out as more foreign than even the other foreigners present. Not an inch less than Dad's height, maybe taller even, he picked up and examined the plates, napkins, cutlery, perplexed by some, appraising others, and had decided he was most delighted with the station. He ate very lightly, his whippet frame sustained apparently by his heroic intake of purple wine, or velvet. His bold, ruby-hue skin just barely covered by his folk garb was exceptionally smooth, soft, and clean. He had all sorts of unique tattoos and piercings, as per his own people's customs, but one thing she noticed was that he was always barefoot. Clef would giggle to herself when the stranger took his dishes to the scullery, where he'd thank Dad with a near-bent double bow at the hip, almost hitting him in the process. Maximo Sendrico Penpore, the 7th Penpore of Sendrix Tower, was more than happy to reciprocate, in keeping with common propriety of course. After this display, a warm embrace would quickly progress to hushed, spirited conversation in the Sugar tongue. San Malo Mahat, the Sugari man, a hafti, uttered with a flourish of his right hand, lifting it to his forehead and then down to his heart. San Mahalo Mahat sir, Dad replied in kind. Clef would mutter to herself imitating the exchanges she observed closely, Saman Malo, Samamahalo Mahat. Saman Malo, She had no time this morning though, so she cleared her delf and proceeded to final inspection. Pause. Pristine. Packed. A confident nod. Everything double and triple checked. 3 more nods, counting. Silence, then. What did you forget? Clef gasped and spun on the spot, suddenly looking and acting very 3 years old. Nothing. I did all my chores and everyone else's, packed everything, I'm ready to go. He rolled his eye exasperated at the display, took a large puff from a cork pipe, then repeated firmly. What did you forget, Clef Napter? Still oblivious, she protested, now fuming at her father's use of her full name. I don't know, what didn't I do? This is wasting valuable time, Dad. He chuckled at his youngest child, and raised an eyebrow in challenge. All right, I'll give you a hint, though I don't really see why I should. He winked at the Shigaraman now, who was enjoying the scene immensely. Quit stalling, old man, out with it. He feigned shock, threw another knowing glance to his friend, then proceeded. Okay, here we go, who did you forget? Like a Rolodex of the mind, she flipped through everyone she knew or had ever met. Alpa, Punzu, Art, Mrs. Thorgood and her sister, the Dowager. No. Dad, well, obviously not him. Lambda, the guardsman, the guests. All accounted for. The 11 elk stags. Of course not, all right they're eating carrots, so who? Who? It was that moment, at the threshold of revelation, that Maximo thought he saw what he often thought he saw when he looked on his youngest and only daughter's countenance, some flash or glint of sapphire and ruby-light shimmer fast across her already astonishing irises. Just like her mother's eyes, just like a sunray caught against a rainbow salmon scale. Nanya. He nodded, yes, Nanya. She bristled, winced, the revelation stung, an arrow to the heart. How could I forget Nanya Mish? Her most favoritist person in the whole, wide woods. All her best laid plans looked amateurish now if she could forget this. The jars and bottles of beetle shells, chitins, fish scales, nuts, seeds, iders, gossamers, tinctures, all the tiny baubles she foraged and fermented around the camp, all to trade at the festival she would be late for if she didn't sort out her grandmother. We must remedy this situation, post-haste. Honey, her father inquired gently, pulling her back to reality. Emboldened, she straightened up, saluted, and off she went to do her duty. To get to the festival, of course. Nanya's home was at Mishet, a half-hour round trip for Clef, easy-peasy beetle breezy. She scrambled into action, piling the freshest and most filling leftovers from breakfast into Acacia pots, then decanted some fresh milk from the cool store into a few flasks that should keep well into the next couple of days, and then finally packed some of her special reserve pom chocolate, her and Nanya's favorite. Before she knew it, Clef and her huge backpack were clanking lopsided and haphazardly down the overgrown trail to Nanya's house. Her yurt. It wasn't anything fancy really, just a really big tent shaped a bit like a bungalow, surrounded by a rickety old fence, on the southern bank of the Terwigan River. It's a nice, peaceful grove for her elderly grandmother. There was a little garden, fallow and full of birds, bees, and butterflies. All around it, tied to the harnesses of the yurt, hanging from the trellises and overgrown pergolas, ribboned around branches, flowers, and tree trunks, dangled flickering bunting of purple, blue, white and green, that fluttered and flapped in the slightest breeze. The whole area around Mishet buzzed with a sort of potency, a mysterious aura of sound and smoke that casts a soft glow on every surface. The air was alive with magic. Billowing from the roof, a grand column of lavender cloud rose stoutly several meters, then collapsed into curling, slimmer streams down to the grass, hovering in unbroken strips disturbed only by Clef's clambering straight through them, down the grassy path to the canvas opening of the yurt. As the scent of the haze broke over her, Clef choked and coughed, inhaling the rich perfumes deeper, catching her breath from running there so fast. Head spinning, just for an instant, just a flash, she felt suddenly pulled back to her dream, her nightmare, from the night before, well, this morning really. Something was bothering her, standing right in front of her but with each step closer to revelation, one step further out of reach. Her heart raced, and poof, it was over before it started. Shaking herself back to attention, she stuck her head through the opening and whispered, "Nanya." Hearing no response, she lifted back the flap of the doorway. "Nanya," she bellowed into the smoky chamber louder now. Through the haze and in, a soft and gentle purr came lilting from the far side of the tent. "Is Arma Clef come see Nanya?" The cloud began to thin fairly quick through the open ceiling and front door, bringing a little bit of much-needed light and air to the room around them. Chirping and tapping on the walls and surfaces all around her, a collection of brass and copper censers and thuribles spewed out heavy layers of perfume and incense, the source of the rings and cloud stacks outside. Atop a pile of strange rugs lay stranger, large cushions and scattered flower petals, while enchanted tomes and manuscripts floated, somehow dangling in the air. All up the height of the walls were shelves, heavy laden with all sorts of colored glasses, crystals, waxes, and papers. Strewn manuscripts, each written in any number of alien scratches, sat next to inkwells and peacocking plume quills, all dotted around the tables and desks, some of them even enchanted to write on their own. Wicker-tied baskets erupted like cornucopia with donations from the locals. Further along the walls and cupboard tops were scattered jugs, jars, hanging onions and garlic, small game and birds, and a deep jade staff, perched against a wall, fashioned at the end into a loop of woven neon blue gossamer, that seemed to shimmer and ripple on its own, like a vast dream catcher with 3 great owl feathers. Amongst all these trinkets and tchotchkes sat a heap of silks and furry ginger and white tufts. Nanya Mish sat most contently with a barbacoa askew on her head. Her fluffy cheeks and toothless grin beamed at her only granddaughter. Her milky eyes blind, she groped outward with chubby paws, beckoning a hug. "Bani Bani, I love and missed, where Nanya kisses Nanaya," she babbled, in the old Phalanxy dialect. "Emma Nanya missed too," Clef replied, in a deep hug that reminded her of her bed in the hollow. She let go and looked at her grandmother, laughing as she patted down her brushed-up fur. Puffed and perfumed with talc and cold cream, it would have slowly fallen back down anyway while the two chirped away in animated conversation. Clef took out the food and stored the milk away nearby in a dark cupboard, explained about the festival today, asked how she was keeping. Nanya Mish would stop and pick up one of the many cats of all shapes, breeds, and sizes milling around every surface of the yurt. Some of them stretched and slept, others mewed to one another, strolling in and out of the entrance at their leisure. Occasionally, a terrified Emma Moores would be directed here or there to piles of correspondence. There was nothing unusual in this for Clef, who just got on with checking the food and storing the milk. Mish was in rude health but her range of motion was not what it used to be. She never complained about it, asserting that everything she needed was always within reach, pointing out all of her strategically placed creature comforts, including a large box of sweets, and a set of ornate tongs a local blacksmith fashioned for her, for getting things just out of reach. That said, she was stuck sitting on her tarp alone on top of the piled-up cushions, in front of the wooden altar where she performed her craft. Atop the altar was a crystal ball the size of a melon, billowing inside with bright blue plasma, alongside a set of tarot cards for Fetzbeck, a crucible, 6 smooth, colored gemstones, and a mysterious onyx candle that burned a dark, light engulfing flame. Suddenly Clef reverted to her mother's tongue, all her old angst expended, saying, "Nanya, I had a weird dream last night, a nightmare really." Nanya dropped a fat ginger tabby she was inspecting, looking seriously at her only granddaughter. Anno, Nanyasi, dreamist so ne, Orzialan, Bleish." She hissed the word. Bleish is a word for darkness or stupor in Old Unks. Nanya groped for Clef's face now, so she got up and walked to her, pressed her Nanya's fluffy paw to her. Breathing deep, she massaged around her face, cheeks, fluffy ear tips, and finally eyes, all the while ululating a low, purring throat spell, ano ano ano, Suntikes, wahan ano en ano.
She was nearing the end, ano ano ano, tastet, eichis bleichsavon asomon, bleich, naya naya naya.
She tapped the top of her head twice to signal she was done. Clef returned to her pillow seat on the other side of the table, eager for the results of her analysis. She grew anxious of the time away from preparations but had to know more about the Bleich Nanya saw. What do you mean you saw something, Nanya? Something Bleich? Nanya nodded. She proceeded to draw 5 cards of Fetzbeck, turning over one to reveal a black bird. She then put the 6 gemstones in a mahogany box, rattled and shook the box until one fell out through the bottom, an opal. Next, she took a fire lily flower and stripped its petals, a few pinches of saltash powder, poured water and mashed all in the crucible to a fine paste. Using her fingers, she drew 4 lines on her face with the paste, 2 strokes on each cheek, and a crescent moon on the forehead, all while muttering the same throat spell as before uninterrupted. Now the scary part happened. All the rituals in order, the light in the room started to disappear to the pulsating din of the onyx candle dark, the mists of the crystal glowing brighter and swirling, just like a dream. All the elements awakened. Hands grasping into a veil. A silhouetted figure falls down. Hexes lash on the wind. And all was calm then as they mouthed across the table, in unison. Bones. Chapter 2. Grim Portents. Standing on a high balcony, sprayed lightly by the thundering waterfalls sweeping over the edge of the Red Fang Mountains above, down thousands of feet to the Lake Tawi below, was a most suitable place for undisturbed reflection. The white noise from the falls was a perfect panacea to the demands of the fortress they flowed out from under. It also happened to be a nice spot for a hushed rendezvous, where even the heightened hearing of a passing Upinda guardsman might struggle to catch every word. The shadowy figure pacing there presently, back and forth, back and forth. He was intent on both contemplation and rendezvous that night. Long had he been burdened by the concoction of pernicious and diabolical plans that, much like this balcony, dangled precariously over the precipice of a great, beckoning moor. They paced, to and fro, muttering away to themselves, over and over about fruition or failure. All the while, one of the worst thunderstorms in recent memory raged in the stone peaks of Stormtop, nestled into which the silhouetted fortress overlooked the expanse of forest and land below. On any other day, you could see all the way to the shimmering speck of Palais in Farkamathan, down by the sea, and all over the top canopy of the woods, though not quite as far as the very farthest reaches of the White Tower of Whirlsend in Grimclav. For an hour or more now, lightning raked across the sky and struck the cliffs hard, the waterfalls gushing faster and louder than ever. From behind billowy white and rose curtains whipping wildly in the crosswinds, a voice came through the vacuum inquiring. "Sir, I've come as requested, are you there?" The gruff, breathless voice of a guardsman cut through the heady silence and buffering buzz of the balcony, his voice perceptible only to a fellow Upinda ear through the babbling waters. "I have the reports you requested." He wore regalia signifying meritorious service on the battlefield, a captain no doubt, one of few veterans of the last war. The pacing figure he inquired for was his senior, a general, who skulked melancholy and menacing towards the curtained entrance. The general was a Upinda baron of great military renown in his time, from victor on the battlefield, to loser in grand campaigns, captive prisoner yet another instance. Now a general baronet of Valewood, commanding the bulwark of the kingdom's defences from the fortress in the sky, across which no enemy would ever advance into our realm, and from which our realm would reach out into the hinterlands between the mountains and the Sugari Desert, be it in conquest or settlement. The High King himself had bestowed upon him this boon, to a Upinda of the Woodkin rather than a Stornishman of his own kind. Little did the king know his grave mistake locking his realm behind an unconquerable fortress, so readily it can become the cage you rot in. The forces at Stormtop Peak represented the vanguard of Valewood's military might, measured not only in their ferocity on the war front, but also for their chivalrous code of honor, their lawful righteousness, and just reputation. As the General Baronet, or GB, lingered on in years, seemingly longer than any mere mortal Upinder, his legend touched the lives of many extant generations of soldiers to pass under his command. He is one of the few remaining veterans who fought for Hale Hearth an age ago when during the Sundering, even then, in his youth, renowned for heroic achievements, he witnessed the sack and rapine of Yup through now-aged eyes. That is why the spires of Stormtop fly two flags, one black and one white. The white to represent the peace of the pact, and the black to mourn the harrying of Yup. But a change had come over him in recent years. Where maturity should ripen into the weary dignity of fatigue and death, suddenly the general had bulked, mutated, into an enormous mass of heaving muscle and sinew, sweat and phlegm, strong enough to lift a cannon in one hand, but a warped and tortuous thing on the other, dripping and gargling, never seen disrobed and uncloaked. Many of even his most loyal comrades speculated on the nature and potential cause of this change, as well as on his uncharacteristic temper. He would lash out in violent outbursts against loyal allies, adoring cadets, even venerated veterans he'd maimed, brutalized, and even killed. Some say it began during routine sparring exercises where in recent years, he seemed to lose all control, striking out in visceral, feral rage. Nowadays, his rancor knew no bounds, and for a guardsman or cadet to end up on the mortal end of his anger was a daily occurrence. Troop morale was at a very low ebb, the same troops who conspired in secret during their downtime, always fearful of surveillance, to hold someone to account for his behavior. They found they were unable to make any representation to the twisted form that now led them, but refused to accept their lot with drooped ears and tucked tails. Frustratingly though, it was as if every stone, window, doorknob and light fixture in the fortress were spying on them, so quickly word reached him of even a hint of treachery, and those accused removed, permanently. Stood before this very monstrosity, it took everything the poor border collie Captain Liffey could muster to keep his mettle. "I called for you hours ago." "I apologize, sir. Sir, there were some resources not immediately accounted for, that I insisted be included in the report. I was delayed, regrettably." An uncomfortable silence. The dim chamber wasn't only muffled by the storm and the falls outside. With his hood raised, you couldn't discern the general's expression to gauge his mood. The silence lingered, both stood perfectly still, the captain holding his report tightly, eyes locked to a spot of cobweb on the nearest wall. With a sickly wheeze and phlegmy cough, the silence broke. "Very well, proceed." Captain Liffey, tail wagging, relaxed and relayed a statistical account of various material requested, its readiness for deployment. Troop numbers. Confirmation of routes. GB listened intently, complete silence broken only by the occasional, wheezy rattle. "So, you see, the Red Fang 4 Company and Farthing's host will already be assembled on either bank for rapid deployment, while the main force cuts through the center. The maritime launch is quite feasible if all seem to be going according to the machinations of schemes long set in motion, plans that might see Yup restored. Might see the general knelt triumphant before the throne of Hale Hearth, savior of the Upinder, before he passes on to doggy heaven. And of course, an end to any sickening pacts with Vale men and woodkin, replaced by the glorious restoration of Upinder hegemony." The general mused to himself while the captain waxed strategy and contingency to deaf ears. Sir. Captain Liffey looked up from his work, eyes suddenly widening as the general's muscular claws struck out at him in step to a lightning crack, grabbed him by the throat and held him aloft with one limb like a child's plaything. His legs flailed wildly below, ears fell down in fear and whimpering at the close-up sight of the general's decomposing face, white eyes, fetid breath. What little candlelight filled the room was extinguished by the rush of air from the striking claws. Through the thick wick smoke, 2 milky white eyes gleamed out from beneath the wheezing cowl. A hot wall of his breath like 1,000 bogs was all the captain could choke for air through. "GHHHGH, don't, please. GHHGH. He spluttered powerlessly as the general's grip tightened around his windpipe. The general now strode out through the billowing curtains, captain held out in front, across the slippery wet marble of the promontory balcony. The storm still swirling above and crackling lightning fizzing around the sky, the guttural chug of the falls deafening all. Through the struggling gulps of the captain gasping desperately for air, clawing and gnashing into the arm holding him aloft. "Good boy, Liffey," the general replied. In step with a great crack of lightning above, he snapped the captain's neck like a matchstick. Loosening his grip as the body went limp, the lifeless corpse slackening, the general lifted him over the balcony and tossed his body into the gulping moor below. Hovering where the body fell, lingered an ethereal spirit of Captain Liffey, slowly being consumed by the general. "Very good indeed," a last gurgling rattle spoke. The general turned fast, returned through the billowing curtains of white and rose silk. They seemed to maneuver around him, as if avoiding his foul touch. In the chamber, there hung a number of truly enormous canvases, portraits of distinguished officers, generous benefactors, and memorable landscapes, dark pictures left with no candle to light them now. The general dripped onto the parquet floor, examining the strewn paper reports in a renewed fugue, when one of the portraits spoke out into the silence. "That wasn't really necessary, was it?" The deadpan voice of a bemused gentleman, his outline now visible behind the silky curtains, cut across the chambers. "I don't want to hear it, Bird." The general growled back through a chesty cough. A most bizarre visage stepped out then, of a great black figure, materializing from nowhere. Or perhaps he was there all along. The room was only lit by the periodic cracks of lightning outside, but even in the darkness the strange garb of this individual was apparent. 2 thin spindly legs with talons like a crow at the foot ends, rising into thick and lustrous robes covered in corvid feathering, sleek and black, all over both arms in the guise of a crow's wings. He was crowned with a priestly adornment, a mask designed to look like a bird's head and beak, fashioned out of traditional materials that made it almost look alive as he cocked his head at the general. By now, he'd walked out from the shadows, revealing something more of his dimensions. Though half his height in stature alone, the atmosphere of the room changed dramatically enough that even the barons seemed moved by it. "Have I not delivered you everything I promised, Mutt?" The crow inquired to the lumbering general, his great black talons clacking against the hard floor. "You'll have to get yourself in order if you want those little puppies below to follow you tomorrow. I'll order you a bath drawn, shall I? And your armor will need refitted before." With an almost imperceptible flick, Baron Alfonso threw a deadly kunai, passing just shy of taking the tip of the crow's beak. "Speak your piece and leave me be. I have no time to bandy witless words with birds tonight, especially after what you've done to me." The crow shaman cocked his head, perplexed. "What's with the attitude, friend? I'm here at your behest, yet you speak to me in such a manner." His inquiry seemed earnest, as though wounded by unspoken accusation. "You lied to me, look at me. I am rotting from within. What have you done to me?" Visibly agitated, Alfonso tore off his robes to reveal the extent of the curse on his flesh. His arms, head, neck and shoulders seemed normal and healthy for his age, but below. Organ, flesh, bone, blood and bile were all patchwork and stitches, decomposing and rotten masses and tumors of disgusting stenches and gurgles. "The spirit of Captain Liffey didn't even give me a full day's worth of power. How am I supposed to kill the king looking like this?" He swiped out angrily at the crow, striking only empty air, where he was moments before, now perched gracefully atop a great mounted stag head across the room. "Tisk tisk, friend. 'Twas you whom struck the bargain with me, and I distinctly recall telling you there would be consequences. You do not deter idly from death's door, there's always a price. Nothing received without sacrifice." He chuckled lightly. "Your little campaign would be impossible without the power I have given you. Yes, forsooth, you are mine now, Mutt, but soon, everything will be mine. You are alone now, my friend, but soon you will find yourself in most pleasant and abundant company. The general interjected with a snarl, this was not the cost you described, bird. You said that I would live long enough to see Yuppie restored if I gave my soul to you. You think those troops will follow me into the field? I'm a monster. He pawed at the gruesome body below, gently pressing and squeezing at the rot. The crow cackled back, well duh. You're hardly going to walk into a Faustian pact if I tell you the whole deal up front, are you? No longer a mere canine, Baron Alfonso was now a bulging carcass, far taller and wider than before, partway transformed into a monstrous werbore of some kind even larger than the largest one known to the woods. Bony spines erupted from his body's corners, spurs and claws tangled into great screws at the ends of his arms. The upper part restored by Captain Liffey's spirit was now disabled, perhaps to conserve the energy required to power the illusion. You could see his fangs pushing out of his gaping, drooling mouth now. And worst of all, those milky, dead eyes, like a drowned carcass washed up on a beach. Wet tears streamed down his aching face, where the canines had pierced through the cheek's flesh. He slabbered weakly, who would follow this? The crow stepped off the stag's head and floated gracefully back to the floor, landing on dainty tiptoes. They will follow you, Mutt. I have seen to it. Mark this day, my friend, for Yupp will be restored to glory and the Valewood Pact will end in ashes. The Stornishmen will be driven back to the ocean, and the darkness now festering inside you will envelop what remains of this land, but not until after we have our fun with it, right? Fear not thy fate, Jonah, for I am everywhere you might run. You are a pioneer, the very first to walk the great pilgrimage of tomorrow, the opening move to a glorious game. You are for war tomorrow, Baron. With an exuberant genuflection, the crow turned to the silk curtains and, once through, departed in an eruption of black smoke and feathers off into the sky. Enraptured now by a hot rage, Baron Alfonso tore apart his balcony apartment, shredded the curtains, smashed the wardrobe, tore lumps from the canvas paintings, ripped out the fixtures and punched holes through the stone walls. As his howls echoed through the fortress that night, no soldier darkened the nearest 3 corridors adjacent to Baron Alfonso's chambers in the promontory wing. The howls were so loud that some of the soldiers hoped that maybe the raging waterfalls could carry them all the way to Carmarthen, to the king. And of course, being dogs, many involuntarily howled along in solace with the monster. Bones. Bones. Clef came to. Her tea was cold as she gulped it down while Nanya fussed, teetering this way or that on her cushion tucked, while talking far too fast for her dozing granddaughter. Coming to her senses, she realized she'd drifted off while flicking through a book that happened to float nearby, time-worn and splitting along the spine, dangling lazily in the smoky air. Ch.1-2, the first god of the wood was the title, above the author's name she had to really squint at. Long, Lock. Black Oliver. The coloured centerfold was a map Clef recognized on sight, the banks of Riverwood along the Terwigan River, and her father's domain. Clef couldn't understand it all. She was very young still. She rarely practiced reading outside of mandatory classes with Dad, but she managed to work out that Terwigan is the Stornish word for Ch.1, and the twin towns of Terwigan Bridge are so named because that's where they built Long Bridget over the Terwigan. But before that name, it was called Ch.1, the name of an immortal life-giving serpent whom legend says sacrificed herself by eating away along the course of the Terwigan inland from the coast so that the sea turtles could lay their clutches of eggs safely, shortly before dying of a hernia from eating too much. The druids of the Woodkin, like Panzu, could tell you more about them than I've learnt in a lifetime, but it boils down to very old myths about turtles, sea snakes, sharks, and all sorts of other things that date back further than we have time to remember. When we meet up, I'll ask him to break it all down for us, since the festival seems like the right place to ask, why were we all gathering there? Nanya's place was so nice and warm, she was so animated and inquisitive, the air alive with her words and the spells. Time marched on and slowly Clef forgot all about the dream. What dream, she'd say. Dreaming about the festival, that's right. the sweets, the biennale, the rush she was in. I say time marched on, but time, memory, it all seemed to become irregular in Nanya's place, and what felt like ages would pass in minutes, or it would seem like you've only just arrived before you're leaving. Clef stayed to entertain her Nanya Mish as long as she liked. She never bored of her and the sights in her yurt. She was always getting the strangest of widgets delivered, or rolled parchments that singed and fizzled as she read each word, permanently erasing all record. Some exploded, others contained strange instructions to bury or throw the parchment away as soon as finished with, due to some booby trap or hex placed on it. I remember she once got a letter and core wrapped together, that kept writing itself as she read, outlining that she was under a glamour, and would die if she stopped reading. All these packages and dispatches were brought by the Moors, by way of Moors, all across the known world. Like a post office, you'll see later. The little mice of the world were accorded a very important place in the societies of the known world, much to the chagrin of the Phalanxy, relative of their famous adversary, the cat. Network mice of Moors spoke the common squeak, common to all the small mammals and familiar to other species. They could also write in all the languages of the known world through a much guarded process, locked safely away in the Moors itself. All the network mice can read and write, translating the message into squeak, passing it rapidly along their channels to the recipient, for whom the mouse will transcribe the message into their language. Just because we have wagon ropes for a highway doesn't mean we have no marvels of our own. 15 minutes passed before she asked, "What were we talking about again, Nana?" "Nothing, my love," she said, sipping her tea.